event of this year's bird fair in the Osprey stage, and it's a great pleasure to put together an amazing lineup. So we're going to start by bringing on stage the legend that is Roy Dennis. If you haven't read his biography, why? And now let's bring on the legend that followed him, but he's a legend for bird fair, and my boss, Lord Tim Appleton. And last but by no means least, and he's already there trying to sort things out because the technology's gone wrong. And I remember him from many years ago when I first came to bird fair as a spotty youth, helping out with the Osprey reintroduction program. Look at him now.
I'm just going to forget it.
So please welcome to the stage Tim MacKrill.
Oh dear, I feel a bit under pressure sitting next to these two. Anyway, so what we're going to do over the course of the next 45 minutes or so, now I've got my laptop working, which is always a good sign, is talk about the early days of the Osprey project and the impact that it's had. And I've got a few questions lined up for these two who are fairly influential in what's happened, I think it's fair to say. And we're also going to touch on towards the end the work we've done more recently with white-tailed eagles, because it was really the natural progression from ospreys to restoring another lost bird to the skies of England. So I think the thing to point out about both species, about osprey and white-tailed eagle, is they're species that should be widespread and common. One of the things I always remember Roy saying to me very early on is that rare birds shouldn't be confined to nature reserves, they shouldn't be rare. And white-tailed eagles and ospreys were both numerous across the whole of Britain, historically speaking, but were relentlessly persecuted. And it wasn't until, in the case of the osprey, till the 50s, that the recovery really started. And we could talk about this in so much more detail, but of course there's been no one who's done more for the recovery of ospreys in Britain, and in probably Europe, I think it's fair to say, than Roy. And I thought I might embarrass Roy with a couple of early photos here from your early days at Loch Garten. You might recognise one or two of them.
I was quite handsome.
Oh dear. Not bad still. But Roy obviously has played an instrumental role, and I thought it might be quite interesting, Roy, to just hear how you first got involved and how things have moved on from those early days.
Well, we were talking earlier with some of the young people about the value of mentors, and in 1959 I was looking at what was I going to do. I was going to leave school, and they suggested that I should go to Harwell and do atomic engineering. And I went with 3 people from our school. We had no biological sciences. In those days, you learned Latin and applied maths and God knows what. And I was 3 days there, and I thought, this is hellish. And then there was a letter. Would I come to London and be an assistant warden? The following year I went to Fareham, had a brilliant year on Fareham. And in the autumn, George Waterston turned up. He was a famous ornithologist in Edinburgh. He was the head of RSTV. He started the Fareham Bird Observatory. He started the Scottish Ornithologist Club. He was there for a week, and he said, Roy, the very first time we've got young ospreys and we've shown 15,000 people this pair of birds. Would you like to be warden next year? And the hands shot up. And I've always said to these things, so much in life is serendipity. Chance comes up, take it, be bold, and carry on. And that proved to be just a great chance of one pair of ospreys, and I was hooked. And people say, is the osprey your favourite bird? And I said, I've never had a favourite bird. I've worked on so many different ones, and whichever one you're working on is really interesting, then you move on to something else. But that first pair was important, and we managed to build up that population.
And it built up by the mid-90s to around about 100 breeding pairs. So that's a photo taken of Roy, probably a lot of garden. That's Richard Thaxton in the middle.
And he's here today.
He's here in a kilt, you said?
Yeah. He told me it's a Capercaillie kilt. I've never heard of such a thing.
Not a feather one, is it?
What?
Not a feather one.
No. It's just a colour. Brown, bluish.
But the point was that the population had increased from that single pair in 54 up to 100 pairs. And at that point, Rutland Water, which we'll come on to, was really well established. And so because it's a huge reservoir in the middle of England, more and more ospreys were seen on migration. And so, well, I'll let Tim, you tell the story of how you first invited Roy down to...
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, and I'll take it back a little bit further, as Tim just mentioned. We were getting single birds going through really almost at the beginning. I started the job in 1975 when they were still building the dam. So there was very little water at that point. But the water company was interested in nature, and that's given their credit, Agri Water authorities, really were interested in nature, they were interested in recreation. It was the first time, really, that since the 1973 Water Act, that they had to take into consideration. And of course, with the birds coming, and of course it's ducks and things like that to begin with, then of course they put in lots of fish. And I think they put in something like 72 tons of fish, of course, trout and things like that. Which of course, if you're an osprey, you're sort of rubbing your talons together and thinking, wow, this looks like easy meals. So that's really, we see them going through, but they were always in the spring, stopping briefly, probably feeding, and then moving on. So the first thing we did was to actually build a nest. This was something called health and safety. I don't think we'd heard about it in those days. And Chris Park, who was his warden at the time, climbed right up and it's precariously, it's crazy now to think about it, and built the first nest. Of course, nothing used it. But then the next stage was I read about various things like puffins being attracted to nests and by making little plastic or polystyrene type models. So we then made a series of polystyrene ospreys, put them up thinking that would attract the ospreys. Of course, complete failure. We kept on seeing going through, coming back, going through, coming back, until in 1994, two birds stayed, and that was really what triggered. That was a spark moment, a great word, when they were literally right outside my cottage. I'm very lucky where I live. I literally got the water right in front of us. And of course, two birds, wasn't paired, obviously can do things. And of course, until Roy they came out and said, right, mate, we've got these amazing birds. They're two males, Tim. They're not going to do an awful lot. Sorry, thanks, Roy. That was really helpful. But it was exceedingly helpful because it then gave us the chance to talk about the possibility of actually reintroducing, well, we wouldn't really reintroduce it, actually a form of reintroduction by translocating birds. So we looked at various other methods, and in the end it was the only way. And the only place in the, I think at the time in the world, where ospreys had been translocated was in America, wasn't it? We went across to Minnesota together and we learned about the process of bringing chicks down. Now that was the easy part. When you come to the bureaucracy of various organisations, we won't mention, will we, to get the licensing to actually take birds from nests from one country, let alone then bring them to another country, Scotland, England. That was quite an interesting process, and that took a little while to do. But then, of course,
not a little while.
Yeah, sorry. Well, I'm trying
years.
I'm trying to make sure they don't think it's a 3-year story. This one, but it was a momentous occasion. I think when eventually, and we had. I should say also, again, credit to the water company who then funded the project and have actually supported it ever since. So, and then, of course, that was the start. We had to then. Roy was obviously liaising with people in Scotland, landowners. And if I can just say quickly, the first birds came down, tell me differently in a minute, in 1996. But the authorities at the time said you can only take the third chick. Now in Scotland they don't have 72 million trout oars that are going into a little pool. So fish is obviously hard to get, therefore often the third chick, I suspect, doesn't survive. Would that be right, Roy? So, taking the story forward from that, the next stage was seeing the survival rate in that first year. And of course, we built some amazing release pens up on the side of Black's Hill, which anyone does know the reserve. A great place, and of course, it's all under Roy's guidance of what to do. And we had, I think, was it 3 birds or?
You had 6, didn't you?
Yeah, oh yes, the first year, so per nest. And sadly, the weak bird just did not survive. I think we had 3 actually survive. But immediately the authorities saw that by even the weakest bird, 3 of them did survive. Now in the wild, probably they wouldn't have. So immediately what they said to us, right, in 1997, you can now take the middle chick, and so the third chick suddenly becomes the middle chick in Scotland, and usually the 2 survive, I think is right. So we had actually, we were increasing the population automatically, and of course the the second chick is now back in Rutland, being reared very secretly, but we're handing the food through behind the pens. And of course we increased the population, and then for me the most exciting thing then was in 1999 to wander up into the local wood, Burley Wood, and really nobody knew what was happening at all. And I came round onto the hillside and suddenly saw a bird building a nest. That was a really quite an passionate and amazing moment for me. And of course it carried on in 2000, it found a mate, and in 2001 I walked up the hillside and found a chick. I was the first person since 1847 in England to actually see an Osprey chick. And that was really, as you can imagine, an extraordinary story. We shared it and it was just incredible. That's really my story.
Thank you, Tim.
If I could say something.
Can I just say one thing? Because I mean, there are two very modest men here most of the time. But seriously, I was a very young schoolboy, and I got involved as a volunteer in spotting. I'm just going to get abused for the next one. I got involved as a young schoolboy in 1997, which was the second year. But I think it's really important to state that the effort that you went to get this project underway. I mean, how many of you in here have seen an osprey in Rutland? Now, you might have seen them migrating through, but were it not for the determination of Tim and Roy, the project wouldn't have happened, because all manner of people tried to stop it, including conservation bodies who will probably remain nameless, but you can come and speak to us afterwards and we'll tell you really what happened.
Yes.
But I think the important thing is, and I've subsequently gone on to set up the Osprey Leadership Foundation, and we work with young people, and one of the things we always say is that you have to be bold and you have to have the courage of your convictions, and that is exactly what Tim and Roy have. And I feel very lucky to have had them both as mentors who have really influenced my career since then. And it wasn't easy, Roy, was it? Those early.
Well, see, one of the most important things is that I came down to see this guy, Tim. And it's much easier to do projects if you immediately recognise a soul like you that's going to do something, get on with it, and then you get on with it. And then you go back to the house and he's got this immense load of wine covered with dust that I've never seen the day of life, and we have one of those. So it's really important that you've got to get on with these projects, and too often we put a project forward and then it needs to go to 3 committees and another committee and a scientific committee, by which time life has gone on. And then the other things, which is sad, that we have to take the smallest chick, and those are the most likely ones to die. But if you're working with wildlife, you're ready to take the bigger chick, because the parents can rear the younger chick better than you can. Yeah. And that's very difficult. The people who are judging you are not ornithologists, or more importantly, not field naturalists. And we're having that problem today. And my attitude is, if we're to save the planet, we have to let everyone who's competent get on with restoring the wild.
Hear, hear.
So, obviously, as Tim has told you a bit about what happened, but one of the really exciting developments of the project was the fact that in the late 90s and the early 2000s, satellite tracking was really in its infancy. And one of the things we were able to do with the project was to actually follow some of the birds on migration from Rutland to West Africa, and in some cases from Scotland to West Africa, and that opened up a whole new element to the work we were doing, because you suddenly realise that it's not quite right to call them the Rutland Ospreys, because they're only here for a relatively small proportion of their life, or less than half. You've got to think about the migration route, you've got to think about the wintering grounds, and that was really groundbreaking work. And we found all sorts of things about osprey migration, that now we kind of take for granted, but at the time we just didn't know. Putting these tiny radios on the birds and understanding now in minute by minute detail how they undertake their journey, how they fly, where they go, has just completely changed our understanding of their annual life cycle. But I've just got a couple of maps which just show you, that illustrate the hazards that young ospreys face on their first migration and the real barriers that there are to restoring a population. So I've just picked out two. Roy, this was one that you tagged. I think this was after we'd done the work at Rutland Water in 2012.
Stan.
So I think you want to tell us a bit about that bird.
I found it very difficult ever to give birds names, and I'm against it, and occasionally I am, and usually the person dies within a few years. So I'm very loath to give names to birds, but this one went to the Canaries and didn't stop, and went on to the Cape Verdes and didn't stop, and must have died somewhere in the ocean. But it was very interesting, because I've been to the Cape Verdes twice to look at ospreys, and they just look like ours. And I think they're all birds which got lost in Cape Verdes. That's the one, yeah. And it's this huge distances. Some of these birds are right out in the ocean, and one or two we've had out there, and we never get people, especially nowadays, can't you go and rescue them? And I remember once we had a honey buzzard, obviously on a log in the North Atlantic, and someone said, can't you go and rescue it? And about that time, a group of Gambian and Senegalese people were trying to get to Europe, were drowned in the North Atlantic, the South Atlantic. And I'm thinking, are we going to save a honey buzzard, or are we going to save 200 locals? And it wasn't possible. And it tells you what's happening. And those losses have always been. But the interesting thing is that our birds came from Scandinavia. And if you're in Sweden and you want to get to West Africa, you go slightly south-southwest. And as a young bird, you can miss Africa with that track. And over the years, they've learned that they come a bit more south. The adults learn, the young ones have to learn.
And we also followed birds on their first migration from Rutland. So this is one of the birds that took a more easterly route, which is unusual, but you see the long flight it did over the Sahara before it eventually sort of recalibrated and got to Senegal. But what this data really showed us at the time is that the reality for many young ospreys is that they just don't survive. And the satellite tracking that we've done since has shown that there is a huge amount of mortality on the first migration. And so although we'd released 64 young ospreys over the period of those 6 summers, there was no guarantee any of them would come back. But the work that had been done in North America, where translocations have taken place since 1979, indicated it would work. And obviously it has. And as Tim mentioned, one of the first birds to come back was this one, 0397, who became subsequently known as Mr. Rutland for good reason, because he had 32 chicks at the same nest between 2001 and 2015. And Tim, that must have been a really exciting moment when you went up there and saw that. I know you've mentioned it briefly earlier.
Yeah, but you can imagine sort of a bird that had not bred in England for 150 years or more, and that the work you were trying to do was actually to bring this bird back because once the birds are here, I remember Roy actually telling me that one of the reasons it's so important to bring our birds and start this colony in England, in central England, was that the progress of chicks, eventually they were born in Scotland, moving south by like 10 kilometres or 10 years. It would take us, he says, 50, 100 years almost before they would have naturally found their way down south. So that was one, and then I think, wow, this bird, Daddy here, Mr. Rutland, has now fathered all these chicks, and they're now slowly spreading out, and their offspring themselves are now spreading out into other parts of England. I'm sure they'll come into that later on.
So that bird was really the one who really established the population. But now if you look at the league table of the most productive ospreys in Rutland, he's actually not top, because the top bird now is the one who's been to see the ospreys in Manton Bay. Quite a lot. If you haven't been, it's really worth going to see. But the female who's nesting there, who's nested there since 2010, who we call Maya, unringed, but we gave her a name. She'd reared 38 young before this year, and this year she's got another 4 chicks. Sadly, one of them died after fledging, but she's got 3 there now. So she's now up to 41 birds. And in all the decades of monitoring that Roy's done in Scotland, what he's found is that you do get certain individuals who become incredibly important for the population, Roy, don't you?
Yeah, you can really divide the population into 3. There's the super breeders, and there's various reasons for that. And they can produce 3 young, 3 young, 3 young, 2 young, 3 young, 3 young. What is evident with those pairs is the females are extremely aggressive around the nest. They don't want anyone else near the nest. They just look at another osprey flying over, an intruder, and it knows I'm not going down there because she's really fierce. So she's looking after her young. She makes them eat. My mum used to be saying that, come on, eat up. And when food was scarce.
Yeah, back then.
But these females are so like that, and then you get a third of the population, they do okay. They have good years, bad years, and they can fail. And then you have a third, which are real duffers. The male's not a good fisher, the female is a bit timid, and another bird crashes into the nest and may break the eggs. So it's a bit like us. That's true. So, what you want if you got a young osprey?
Who are you calling a duffer?
No, not at all. If you want to be a successful osprey, you need one of these fierce females, and you need your male to be the best fisher in that region. And if he's the best fisher, he's almost certainly to be at the top of the hierarchy. So if he arrives at the best fishing grounds, anyone else there has to go. And they wait until he catches a fish and then they come. So there's anyone who's kept hens in a hen yard, you know what I'm talking about. There's one always who gets everything. So there's a lot of interest in how these groups grow. And what I'm I'm not proud. We guessed that there would be 12 pairs around Rutland Water, and there's 12 pairs.
Yeah, so the population has really increased over the last few years, and you can see here from that first pair in 2001 with just a single chick, it's slowly but surely increased. And you have to be very patient with these birds because they often don't breed till they're 3, 4, 5 years old. But you can see the number of breeding pairs and the number of fledged young. So fledged young is the line above the bar charts, and the bars are the number of breeding pairs. You can see that they're both on an upward trajectory, and this year has proved to be the most successful year. So this year there are 12 nests, 11 of them have been successful, and they've got a total of 31 chicks in their nests. So it really shows you that the population here is very well established. But one of the really pleasing things about the project, my clicker is going to stop at the very worst possible moment. No, they're not. One of the reasons that the project has been so successful is that although we do have pairs breeding on the nature reserve, we've also had a huge amount of support from local landowners and others who have their own pairs of ospreys. So for example, Joe and Mary on the left there, I worked out the other day that they've had 70 chicks fledged from nests on their land, and they've got another 6 this year. So you can really see how relationships with these kind of people becomes really important. Then there's the local trout farm who was starting, they actually really helped the project in the early days because the fish for the translocated birds came from them. But then as the population grew up, the ospreys realised that was actually a very good place to go and find an easy meal themselves. So they could have just netted off the ponds, but I went to see them and said, look, in Scotland, people charge fairly significant sums of money to go and photograph ospreys at places like this, and we help them to build a hide, and that's been phenomenally successful. And you can now go to Horn Mill and you can get the most incredible views of hunting ospreys. And I don't know if this is going to work. No, it's not. I think we've got to go. We've got to. Don't get stuck. I'll play this on the laptop. This is the sort of view you now get from the hide of an osprey fishing. And if I go back one, you can see that in slow-mo. So it really is fantastic to see how what was a potential problem has really been turned out into something that's beneficial for the local ospreys, but also beneficial for the trout farm. And the owner actually told me that if it wasn't for the photography business that is now incredibly successful, the trout farm would have gone out of business during COVID and the fuel crisis. So diversifying in the way they did was hugely beneficial. And I think the other thing to say is that the osprey is a bird that can really inspire people. We've all got an interest in nature, and many migratory birds fascinate us all, but there's something about the osprey and the osprey story that really captures people's imagination. And because of the migration, they do have the potential to link people here down to West Africa. And Tim, I don't know if you want to talk about the idea you had.
Yeah, anybody knows me, I'm sort of completely passionate about education and inspiring the next generation. And when I started seeing this very early in satellite tracking, we could actually see different places, different routes that they were obviously taking, but some of these routes would be very close to cities, towns, whether it's in France, whether it's in Spain, Northern Africa, and so on. So I thought, well, we could set up a sort of like an email listing group of people, get them to join together. So we get kids in Rutland, perhaps finding a school in maybe central France, maybe in central Spain, and that slowly grew. So kids were starting to sort of connect with a school, maybe talking languages. I think they were doing songs and all sorts of things, and it really sort of set the scene, I think, for the OLS, doesn't it, in many ways. And it was so exciting to see the connection that this one species was bringing to Europe, better than Brexit anyway.
Yeah, well, let's not get onto that. We'll come on to the migration a bit more, but I think the other thing to say about the population here in Rutland is it's not just impacted, it's not just established ospreys here, it's established ospreys elsewhere. And one of the places that it's gone on to really kind of play a key role in establishing is the population that now is on the south coast of England. So I'm going back to Mr. Rutland now, because Mr. Rutland, those 32 chicks, many of them have come back. One of the things about that nest is that the survival of young returning to that nest is exceptionally high. And that's another thing we see, that some birds just produce really high quality young who then come back in really good numbers. And they produce various offspring who are breeding themselves. So the offspring of Mr. Rutland, or a female chick from 2009, is 00, who's had herself a total of 22 chicks prior to this year. And one of her offspring is the female CJ7, who's now breeding down at Poole Harbour. And in 2017, Roy and I started a project with Birds at Poole Harbour to restore ospreys to the south coast. And Roy, I don't know if you'd like to just talk a bit about the background to that.
Yeah, that was interesting. And I think one of the things that happened to do with Rutland Water was that we thought there would be enough birds coming through in spring to bolster that population. And we were slightly wrong, because the main migration of ospreys in spring from Africa to Scotland is along the English-Welsh border, and so quite a lot of birds miss here. But they do come into Poole Harbour, they come into Hampshire and Dorset, and so Poole Harbour was just a great place. some of these things are to do with your life, and I was a young bird watcher who grew up in Hampshire and Dorset, and so I always had a soft spot for what was called the mullet hawk. And the mullet hawk was the osprey and the south coast eating mullets. So people say, have you examined everywhere in Britain for the best place? And you say, well, that'll take you 10 years. Just let's go to Rutland Water and then we'll go to Poole Harbour. And it works. It works extremely well. My father grew up in Wales. And we tried to do a project in Wales. And we got so much opposition, it was really annoying. And then 2 Rutland males decide to stay in Wales and stop females from Scotland. And that was the first year. And so we went back and we said, it'd be good to bolster them up. And they said, no, you can't do it here. Previously, you can't do it here because they were never here. Now we've got 2 pairs, you can't do it because they've already arrived. And again I say that, we have to get serious about wildlife recovery. And I'm particularly pleased that Natural England, now their top line of what they should do in the next 5 years. The first one, more nature recovery and faster. And that's what we need.
So the Poole Harbour project has really taken off, and CJ7 has now reared 9 chicks with a translocated male. And actually that male that breeds at Poole Harbour comes from a nest that Roy's monitored since, I think it's 1960, an SB01.
And this bird comes from the very far north of Caithness. It came from this, which is the very furthest north in Britain.
So, you can really see the impact it's had. And as Roy said, birds from Rutland have gone across to Wales. And we had one particular example. You tend to think that, these places have got, big geographical split between them. But what we've learned through the satellite tracking we've done, the colour ringing, is that the birds move incredible distances. So there was one particular afternoon where our friend and former colleague John Wright was watching an osprey on Lagoon 4, this bird 3J, and he saw her circle up from the nest at 20 to 4 in the afternoon. And at 9 o'clock that night, we got a phone call from the Glasgow Osprey project saying she'd intruded at their nest. So she'd got across to North Wales in less than 5 hours, which if you'd got in your car and tried to negotiate the M6, you would not have been able to do. So it really shows you how moving the birds to Rutland really changed the distribution of ospreys in southern Britain, which is a really pleasing element to the project. I'm skipping through this because I know that we could talk for hours, but you can really see how since that first year 2001 the English and Welsh populations have increased. This is up to 2022 when we were estimated there were about 38 breeding pairs. There's now definitely over 50 pairs in England and Wales, so it's really pleasing to see how the story of osprey in England is really changing all the time.
But I think, can I say something? I think the important thing is that we had that one pair, and then you get a situation which has happened a lot in Britain, is that you have one pair or whatever, or one flower, one rare flower on a nature reserve. It becomes the key thing of that nature reserve, and there seems to be no real interest in trying to make the rare common. Because you don't want to give away your pet. You want, if you've got ospreys here, and there's a guy with a special orchid in Kent, and he comes up to see your osprey, then you want to go and see his orchids, instead of saying, come on guys, let's get them as common as possible. And then they say, do you think we should get rid of this reserve? So it is a tricky human problem there, that we've got to make things common. And I always say, with these birds, you should not need to go to a nature reserve. You should be able to see ospreys as you go to work or your children go to school, and then you're winning.
And I think that's what's happening already. Because,
Oh, yeah.
you know, people in Rutland now, the Osprey is synonymous with the area, and you know, you can be driving around the county. I mean, last year at the bird fair, we had birds flying over the conservationist hub, and they're just part of the fabric of the area now, which I think is really exciting.
And interestingly, one or two hotels are calling themselves the Osprey Hotel or the Osprey. There's a estate agent now. So again, it's sort of bringing the Osprey to a wider audience. So, well, why are you calling it an Osprey estate agent? And of course, the story comes. They probably sell the house on the basis they walk almost down the road and see an Osprey.
But the good thing is that it's not just had an impact here, as Tim mentioned earlier. We've been able to link people through the migration of the Osprey, and this is a really important element to the story, because the reality is that, as I said, they spend only half their life in Rutland or Scotland, wherever they breed. You know, the wintering site and the migration route is also incredibly important, and over the years we've followed many birds south on their migrations and learned so much, and we could talk till midnight about this, so we can't really go into any detail, but to follow individual birds like this one, Muthimurcus, Roy, that was an interesting one that you followed for what 5 years?
Yeah. But I think the really interesting was that when did we put the first GPS radio on?
2007.
Yeah, in 2007, where our radios were much smaller. They were the first ones. We had to calculate how long a battery would last. So we changed. We only want to know where you are every 10 days in winter to try to save the battery, and then we speed it up in the spring. And then suddenly the new ones came in, which were chargeable. They had a service panel on them. We put the first one on, and it was quite an interesting bird, because our little local public primary school was ready to be cut by Murray Council. They wanted to get rid of it, and the head teacher said, we've got to think up ways we can save it. So I said, well, when we do this bird, we'll call it Logie, after Logie Primary School. And that Osprey set off. And previously, all the work done on radio tracking or whatever was usually done by scientists who didn't want to give that information away until they'd written their peer-reviewed papers. So you're looking at 3 to 5 years. And we said, we're going to do it tomorrow. And by chance, Google Earth had just arrived. And we started to put it on Google Earth day after day. And we had hundreds and thousands of people following it all over the world. And I think that was what taught us that this bird, and I remember it went to an island in the archipelago of Guinea at the south, and we knew it never went more than 1 kilometre from the tree it lived in. Grab a fish, go back, grab a fish, and then one morning we looked, it's on its way. We followed it the whole way, and my wife was doing work with the radio, with BBC Radio, and we looked, and it was over the Cairngorms. So both of us raced to its nest, and there she came in. And it was such a thing that we could, we didn't know whether they were coming back in the old days, and now we know. But she was a bit late, and the male had chosen another female, and she was ready to lay eggs, and that resolved in a fight for the whole day, and Logie got rid of that bird and took over her nest again. So suddenly it's human stories. And the Murray Council Education Department got fed up with the number of times that Logie was mentioned, and stories came from all over the world about our little village. It wasn't shut.
And the amazing thing is, this is just some satellite tracking data showing 2 of the birds we followed from Rutland Water, and you can see these are adult birds that we followed, and you can see what master navigators are. The female there, 3005, who fledged from the site bee nest, her average autumn migration was just 12 days to get down to the coast of Senegal. And then when they get there, these two wintered just a couple of miles apart, unknowingly. but their winter range, as Roy says, is so small. So they're just living in a tiny area, flying out to sea once or twice a day, catching fish, and then coming and landing on the same patch of sand every day. And a few years ago, a couple of colleagues, Paul Stammers and John Wright, managed to photograph 30 on the beach in Senegal. So just like, Roy had that excitement of seeing that osprey return back to Scotland, so there's that excitement of seeing that one on its wintering grounds. And the great thing with that part of the Senegalese coast is that if you travel along those beaches, you see a huge number of ospreys from all over Europe. So we've got a dot on the map that shows where the Rutland Osprey is, but what you don't know unless you go there is that on the next door bit of driftwood there's a German osprey, the other side there's one from France, and then maybe there's one from Latvia as well. So it's really interesting to see how they live their life. But just as the way they can draw attention to environmental problems, I'm just going to skip through these slides because I'm conscious of time. Just as we know that they can kind of raise awareness of conservation issues here and issues here, we know that they've been able to do that in West Africa as well. And the reason that they're able to do that is because of the fantastic stories around them. And for me personally, one of my absolute highlights of being involved with the Rutland Osprey project is that I was out in the Saloum Delta in Senegal with a group of volunteers from the project. I don't know if anyone who was on that trip is here, but anyway, Jackie was, yeah. And we happened to come across this osprey perched in the mangroves, and we could see it had a blue ring on the right leg. Not satellite tag, just a colour ring. And unfortunately it flew off before we could identify it, but we had this nagging doubt that it could be a bird from Rutland because the English and Welsh birds are ringed on their right leg. So the next day we changed our plans and we went back in the same boat, went back to the same spot knowing it was an adult bird, it would be there again. Sure enough, it was perched in exactly the same place, and John at the front of the boat managed to take a photo, and it turned out to be a bird that had fledged from the Manton Bay nest just a few years earlier and who was now breeding at a site locally. And I mean, the excitement to see, I nearly capsized the boat, I was that excited, but it really brought home to me, it was quite humbling really to understand the journeys that those birds are making and how they link different parts of the world. But the problem is, when you go down to West Africa, just like here, you see some of the hazards that they face. You see, discarded fishing nets. You see issues with plastic pollution. And so, as Tim mentioned, we were really keen to try and raise awareness of the threats to migratory birds by using the osprey really as a flagship species. And so we've set up a project with local schools, I've got local schools involved, and that, as Tim mentioned, led me to set up the Osprey Leadership Foundation, which is very much about working with young people to help those young people to find their voice and to really hopefully go on to be the kind of leaders that Tim and Roy have been in their careers, to not be afraid of pushing boundaries, to not be afraid of making the odd mistake, but just getting things done, to be honest. And that's what we need desperately in the world. And it's really pleasing to see that some of the young people we worked with in the early days are now really starting to have an impact themselves. Dembo on the left there is from the tiny fishing village in Khartoum. He's just about to start a PhD in a university in Africa. And Emmanuel Jatta, we organised an internship for him last year, and he actually became the first Gambian to ever ring an osprey when he rings some ospreys in Wales. So really brilliant to see how the bird is bringing people together. We were hoping that Nafi in the middle there, who was one of the first young people to get involved in our work, would be here, but sadly her visa, despite us having a sponsor license that allows us to bring people over for a short amount of time, her visa was turned down with appeal, but we weren't able to appeal in time. But that, to me, even that really brought home the fact that these are birds that can cross these international divides, and yet here's a young person with an interest in nature who can't do what the ospreys are doing. And I think, we could get very philosophical about it, but it really brought home to me the arbitrary nature of the boundaries we put in place as humans, whereas the ospreys are just flying between the two continents with no problems at all.
When I was down there at one time with Autumn Watch, and we were looking for an osprey in a what's that? Delta, the place where that Saloum Lagoon. and we had a couple of local fishermen helping us. And then we suddenly found this bird that we had satellite tagged in Wales. And these guys suddenly started waving their arms and, oh, Osprey, Osprey. And then we talked to them, and they never knew the Osprey went to the Europe. And we said, this Osprey, that's where we come from. And they just found that so fascinating that this bird lived in both our countries. And we were joined together by this bird.
So that is the story of ospreys. Now, we're very short of time, so I'm not sure we're going to have too much time to talk about white-tailed eagles. But I just want to tell you very briefly about that project. And the point with the white-tailed eagle is it's just like the osprey. It's a bird that historically was widely distributed across the whole of Britain, as you can see in the maps there. And Roy has been involved with white-tailed eagles since 1968. I found another photo of Roy. Can you tell us a bit about that photo?
He never told me anything about what he was doing. And I will have a word with him. But I was very lucky, but it's not luck, it's being in the right place. And my mentor, George Watson, had finally got permission to bring 4 white-tailed eagles from Norway. And then he phoned me up and said, I want you to talk to the crofters about sheep. And so we had a meeting, probably when we had a dance on Fair Isle, and the islanders said you can do it, but if they start eating the sheep, they've got to go. So we brought them in, and these are the birds arriving in 1968. We have 4. And when you look at it, we've got them on the south coast. The south coast of England is better for white-tailed eagles than Shetlands. But that's not where the last ones were. The last ones were in the north of Scotland. So no matter what animals that are widespread, they're always removed from the places where people can make the most money and grow the most food. So the distribution is nothing to do with what the birds like. It's the farthest away from human persecution. Anyway, we got these 4 birds, and people said, well, and I made double cages, and I kept them apart, and we fed them on rabbits, and we did all sorts of things. And people said, well, how do you know what to do with it? And I said, I learned all that when I was 7 or 8. And I've been wandering all through the woods in southern Hampshire. Our mothers used to turf us out, and there was no worries. They told us who was a bit dodgy and keep away from them and just get on with life. And so we grabbed whatever we could, and we'd take these animals back and we'd say they were lost. And my mother would look at 1 or 2 of them and say, Roy, that one will be dead in the morning. And it was a question mainly looking at their eyes. And if their eyes are bright, they're going to do okay. And if they're not, they're on the way out. So I learned all that, and that's what I did. And we let them go, and 1 of them disappeared in October or May. The other 3 stayed the whole winter. And in the spring, in May, they were going up, April, May, 2,000-3,000 feet above Fair Isle. And 2 females disappeared. And I like to think they went back to Norway, because you can see Norway from Shetland from that time. And the last one was killed eating former petrels and being covered in oil, fish oil, which is their defense mechanism, and it died in the sea. And people said to George and to me, you've had your try, that's it, you can't do it again, even though we wanted to. And it took another 10 years for the government to get it done. And that resulted in the population in Scotland, but the increase was very slow. And the whole time we've always been held back by people who won't take a risk and won't let people who know what they're doing get on with it. So going to this latest one with Tim is just brilliant.
And what's happened with the Isle of Wight project is that in 2018, Roy and I started talking about what might be possible on the south coast, because the thing with white-tailed eagles is that in this country they are synonymous with kind of wild, remote places like the west coast of Scotland, but we know that in Europe they're breeding on the outskirts of Rotterdam, close to the city centre in Helsinki. They're the national bird of Poland, so we know they're living alongside people, and we really felt that the south coast of England was the best place to do it. And Roy, you used to go birding on the Isle of Wight, didn't you?
I think that was the main reason.
Yeah. And this is the thing, you can do all the feasibility studies in the world, but for a species that primarily feeds on fish, all of the estuaries on the south coast of England, just like they're suitable for ospreys, they're suitable for white-tailed eagles. And so, you know, following exactly the same model as the ospreys, we've got permission to, after very lengthy consultations, just like with the ospreys, we got permission to move the birds down.
No, I disagree. The time was not that long.
No.
And what we were lucky with, and I don't know your political persuasion, but Michael Gove was the Minister of the Environment, and for some reason he liked white-tailed eagles, and he wrote in an official document that the white-tailed eagle should come back, and we let it be known to him that we could do it, and he basically pushed it on for us, didn't he?
Yeah, it was an example of you have an opportunity and you have to just take the moment. So we established a partnership with Forestry England, and there was somebody in that organisation, Leanne Sargent, very much the same mindset, wants to just get these projects done. And we've got a licence, and we've now moved a total of 37 young eagles to the Isle of Wight. And in 2023 we had the first pair breed successfully, which was a real milestone, not least because the pair that bred were only 3 years old, so they were breeding really ahead of time. Most young white-tailed eagles don't breed until they're 5 or 6 years old. And what we're seeing is that there's real potential for both the osprey and the white-tailed eagle to spread all along the south coast. And the fantastic thing about the eagles is that we're seeing that there's a very predictable pattern that for the first few years of their life they're incredibly nomadic and they turn up everywhere. We've had several at Rutland Water, they've gone up to the north coast of Scotland, we've had one bird who went to mainland Europe for 2 summers running. But then they come back to the area they regard as home, and the initial territories, these 3 territorial pairs, are all within the expected range from the Isle of Wight. And you know, it just shows that these projects can work, but more than anything what's been really exciting is how the birds have fitted into the landscape. You know, Roy you had an email from a paraglider the other day, didn't you? So,
yeah, but I had one earlier when a paraglider phoned me up and he said, I was out today and there was not much lift at all, and he was over the hills above Portsmouth, and he said, I looked behind me and he said this, I won't say the word, and this great big bird coming towards me, and he said it was monster, and it just came past me and went on, so I decided to follow it, and it knew where the thermal was and I didn't. And I followed it into the thermal, and we went up together to 2,000 feet. And he said it was absolutely fantastic. And then the eagle just went and went to the next thermal, and the guy was left standing. Now, we never knew that hang gliders would be some of our greatest supporters.
So it's really pleasing, and you can read much more about the White-tailed Eagle project on the Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation website, and it's really pleasing to see how the project's developing. There's been no conflict at all with livestock farming, there's been no predation of livestock, and what we see, because we've monitored the diet of the birds very closely, is that as they mature and they reach breeding age, fish is what they're taking. So they can be coastal fish, they can be marine fish like grey mullet and bass in the estuaries or along the coast. They're catching cuttlefish around the Isle of Wight, and then freshwater fish inland around freshwater wetlands. So the bird is fitting in fantastically well, and I think that's testament to what you can achieve if you have a real proactive approach. And Tim, I think that
yeah, I mean, basically sort of I wear an entrepreneurial hat and combine it with conservation and economics, in which I've done with these global bird fairs. You think of the value of that bird to a bird watcher, to the owner of the land who might want to expose the bird to people. People come to Rutland to see the nest here. I mean, how many people have seen the nest here? Okay, so how many people have come here specifically to see the nest rather than say you've travelled some distance? See, quite a few. Now I wonder how many of you might have stayed at a hotel or bed and breakfast. Yeah, 1 or 2 of you. So all of that increases the income coming into the local economies around the world. I passionately believe that, and all the projects I support through conservation, is the local communities should have some physical benefit, some financial benefit. And I think what we've done here at Rutland and what they're doing at Poole and other sites, they're becoming iconic birds that people can latch onto. And once they get a spark and they see this bird plunging into the water, whether it's grabbing a fish or a lamb, whatever. Which of course it does.
That is off-piste.
But if you think about it, there's crazy things that people, one of the papers, when they were trying to reintroduce white-tailed seagulls into Norfolk, headlines in the East Midland Press, the babies will snatch your baby, the ospreys, the white-tailed eagles will snatch the baby from the pram. Absolutely, you need to swear at me, but it's such a shame. That could have benefited enormously if those eagles, as they're doing in other parts of Britain, weren't there. So that's why I think it's really important that people do come see these birds and put something back into the local park.
And if you want to see a white-tailed eagle, the best place to do it at the moment is at Poole Harbour, and you can go out on the fantastic boat trips. I don't know if any of you have done it, but to go out on the boat trip and see the white-tailed eagle pair that are there and the ospreys that are breeding locally is really fantastic. So we're just about out of time, but thank you very much. Just got one coming on. Okay, Roy.
And that is that with all these projects, you're basically working with local people, farmers, landowners, fishermen, and a whole lot. And what they're really looking for is that you are competent and that you will respond immediately if there's an issue, and that you can deal with every issue. Too many, people working in wildlife, they're just not up to that. You've got to walk in and be able to establish contact immediately with an angry farmer. You're good at it. You're good at it. And then you can talk about things. And I say to my colleagues, if we get a complaint, you need to be there that day or the next morning. And on the Isle of Wight, we had one guy phone up and say the eagles have killed 6 lambs. So the next morning, Steve is there with the maps to show where the birds had actually been, because we know where they are every minute of the day. And the guy comes out of his farm and he says, Steve, don't bother. He said, I was just having an appalling day yesterday. And I just thought I'd blame you lot.
So anyway, I know we're out of time, but thank you all very much for coming. Hope you enjoyed the last hour, and thank you very much to Roy and Tim for, not just this afternoon, but all they've done to restore these 2 fantastic birds.
And to Tim MacKrill.